As one of the most well-known and beloved power systems out there, you'd think cursed energy would be a well-constructed system, but I'm not so sure that's the case. The more I think about Jujutsu Kaisen's power system, the more I see flaws in it, and the more I wonder, was serious thought actually put into this power system, or was it just kind of thrown together? Let's find out. There are a couple of issues that really plague Jujutsu Kaisen's power system overall, and we'll be touching on them repeatedly throughout the video. The main overlying issue I have is that it just feels kind of poorly explained, and as a result, it often feels like Gege is just kind of making things up as they go. But that's not the case for everything in the system. For instance, the basic forming of cursed energy is actually extremely solid, and it's one of my favorite aspects of the power system. It's rare to see a power system based off collective energy like this, and it feels like one of the few aspects that is actually fully thought out. Cursed energy is negative energy created by people that then pulls together to make cursed spirits. Pretty simple and understandable. Not only that, but it feels kind of realistic in a way, which I think is pretty cool too. It's no secret that energy, whether positive or negative, can change the vibe of an area immensely. In this way, cursed energy pooling at places like schools and hospitals makes perfect sense. Despite these positives though, cursed energy formation does raise one question for me. What about positive energy? There are places like parks, restaurants, and movie theaters that overall create positive vibes and positive experiences. Why don't these also pool to make something the opposite of cursed spirits? This is a really small issue with the formation, and really it's not even an issue, just a small aspect that leaves me asking questions, which will be a common theme as we go on. One aspect that definitely leaves me with some questions is cursed energy reinforcement. Reinforcement is a really interesting category of cursed energy to me. It reminds me of the basics of Nen, with reinforcement being able to prevent or limit damage. On top of this, quick application of reinforcement causes a black flash, which is one of the coolest aspects of cursed energy in general, and is definitely a fan favorite as well. But that's not what makes it interesting to me. What makes it interesting to me is this concept. The concept of covering a body part to counteract an ability is so cool. It reminds me a lot of the advanced Nen techniques like Gyo or Ken, but there is an issue. We only see this application of reinforcement used one single time. I would have loved to see how this concept can be used for more abilities. Like maybe people could reinforce their eyes to see Sukuna's slashes, or they could reinforce a specific body part to increase defense of an attack, but it reduces the cursed energy around the rest of their body as a risk, similar to Ko or Ryu. I know what you're gonna say. If you want a power system like Nen, just watch Hunter x Hunter. Cursed energy is different, and you're not wrong. They are supposed to be different, but if you're going to introduce a concept like ability resistance for specific abilities, I feel like it needs more than one application, and concepts only having one example is going to be a reoccurring issue. Really, it feels like it might be a concept that Gege wanted to explore more, as all the examples exist only in the Kyoto Goodwill event. So maybe if the story had been more fleshed out, we could have gotten more examples of unique reinforcement. Another aspect that I think could have been more fleshed out is the learning process. This is less of an actual issue with cursed energy and more of a personal gripe. The learning process for cursed energy feels extremely streamlined. It takes a matter of chapters to get Yuji, who is completely new to cursed energy, to the same level as other sorcerers at his same age, and then he kind of just grows from there without any real independent training. I know this was likely done to keep the story of Jujutsu Kaisen going so it didn't get cancelled by Jump, and it didn't run into any quote-unquote pacing issues, but I think a more involved learning process could have been really interesting. Now, I'm not saying we need a whole-ass 15-chapter training arc or anything, but even just a 6-chapter one could have helped a lot in the development of cursed energy itself, and would have made pretty much every feat in Jujutsu Kaisen more meaningful, because as it stands right now, it kind of feels like all it takes to become a first-grade sorcerer in the world of Jujutsu is watching a few emotional movies. Now, I know that we learn way later on in the manga that the reason Yuji is able to grow so fast is because of Sukuna, which is kind of its own issue, but whatever. But that feels more like a quick fix solution to explain his ease of learning than an idea that was actually developed from the beginning of the show. Plus, it's not just Yuji who picked up Jujutsu with no problem. It's also all the modern Culling Games players and Junpei, none of whom have the Sukuna symbiosis. Another aspect a short training arc would have helped with is just character development and growth in general, as the story does struggle with these as well, but that's a topic for another day. So for now, let's move on to cursed techniques. Cursed techniques in concept are really cool. A lot of the abilities Gege came up with are unique and fully fleshed out, making cursed techniques one of the best abilities to understand in shonen, if that makes sense. Basically, what I mean is it is very infrequent that someone will die without using their whole kit. There are very few mystery abilities in Jujutsu Kaisen, which is somewhat uncommon for these kind of series. Take for instance Chainsaw Man or Hunter x Hunter. Both have a number of characters whose abilities are only seen once or are only seen partially before they die or get defeated. That's not something that really happens in Jujutsu Kaisen, and I like that a lot, and it goes against some of my biggest complaints on the power system. However, my feelings on curse techniques are not all positive. There is one issue that I am really not a fan of, and that's how they're distributed. See, because curse techniques are essentially distributed at random, it means a character's potential is also random. The figure detailed in the show is that each sorcerer's potential is 80% their curse technique and 20% them. This means that hardworking characters with interesting abilities like Nanami or Nobara will never be able to reach the same heights of people like Yuta or Gojo, or even Todo, honestly. I understand that there's always going to be some power variance and that some characters are just going to be stronger than others no matter what. I just hate that 80% of a character's potential is preordained by something that is completely random and completely out of their control. It once again feels like a bit of a cop-out. Why spend time having characters develop their own abilities or grow their own way when you can just say that's the way it is because it just is? It feels kind of cheap and it doesn't really exist in the real world. I mean, there is genetics, right? But that's not a huge deal. Obviously, I, a 5'10" dude with the coordination of a Spinda, would never be able to become the basketball player LeBron is. But the difference is, in real life, there are a lot of things you can become good at that are not dependent on your genetics, like music, art, or STEM studies. And in real life, genetics do not determine your fate 100% or even 80%. Hard work and the situation you are born into play a major role. LeBron wouldn't be LeBron if he didn't work his ass off for 2 whole decades, if not more. Meanwhile, in Jujutsu Kaisen, Gojo and Geto become the strongest sorcerers at the age of 18, mostly because of their curse techniques and not much else. This is just another aspect that once again makes the power system feel a bit cheap and kind of underdeveloped. And for the record, there are ways to develop a power system with powerful characters without just saying that's the way it is or writing a long-ass manga. Take, for instance, Chainsaw Man and Full Metal Alchemist. Chainsaw Man has a power system that is very clearly stated at the beginning. The stronger the fear, the stronger the devils. So it makes sense that some devils are naturally stronger than others because they've been associated with a more common fear. It's a simple concept, but it's still a better reason than just because. This concept of fear-based power is kind of applied to cursed spirits, but it doesn't extend to sorcerers, which is where the whole 80% issue mostly exists. Fullmetal Alchemist, on the other hand, takes a different approach that I think would work better for Jujutsu Kaisen. A whole lot of adults. Basically, the only kids in Fullmetal Alchemist are Ed and Al. Everyone they're surrounded by is considered an expert in their field, and as such, they're all naturally powerful, and they attain the power off-screen, which is believable because of the world building set up around the story. Jujutsu Kaisen felt like it was kind of on track to do something similar, as there were a ton of adults in the story, but then after Shibuya, it became so student-focused, and I feel like it kind of lost the plot in that department. But I digress. Let's move on to my favorite aspect of cursed energy: cursed tools. I love cursed tools, even more so than domains. I don't know if there's a specific reason that I love them so much, but the concept of imbuing a weapon with cursed energy to give it an effect is a super cool way to give weapons unique effects in the world of Jujutsu. It feels like such a natural progression of the power system too. A lot of weapons in battle shonens can end up feeling ham-fisted into the story just to give the characters a way to fight, but cursed tools fit so well into Jujutsu Kaisen. The whole power system is based on the pulling and steeping of negative energy to create cursed spirits, so of course it makes sense to have a similar system for creating weapons used in Jujutsu. On top of this, the design for cursed tools are always sick as hell. Even the ones that aren't that important look great, but the powerful ones like Inverted Spear of Heaven and Soul Split Katana are so sick in the best way. Really, the only thing I don't like about cursed tools is that we just don't see a lot of them as per usual. I just wish we got more, man. You know what else is really cool? Domain expansions and subscribing to this channel. We're getting pretty close to 75,000 subscribers, and I would really love to hit that number by the time summer is over. If you enjoy the content you're watching right now, please consider subscribing. It really helps me out, and it helps you out too, as it makes videos way more likely to appear on your homepage. Anyway, domain expansions are such a cool concept in general. Oftentimes in anime, the pinnacle of one's strength amounts to some super big explosion or a powered up version of their most basic attack. So a concept like domains being the strongest ability in Jujutsu Kaisen is really refreshing. The whole idea behind a battle of domains and how domains interact in general is super unique, and I love how each one is a little bit different, and they're not necessarily all 100% in line with the user's technique, which is also pretty cool. It's clear that domains are one of the aspects that have been thoroughly thought out, and that's not even mentioning non-lethal domains, which I find to be even cooler. They're like a little mini game in the middle of battle. I could complain about how few domains we've actually seen, but unlike the other categories, the limited number of domains actually makes sense, so I am somewhat okay with it. But what I am not okay with is the final category we have to talk about, which is binding vows. These things suck. just outright. I could probably make a whole video on why binding vows are fundamentally flawed. In fact, that's what the first draft of this video actually was. But instead of making you sit through that original 8-minute draft, I'll just say this. Binding vows are flawed at their root concept. Binding vows allow a sorcerer to make some sort of unbreakable agreement either with another sorcerer or themselves. The issue I have with binding vows is not when they're made between two different sorcerers, more when they get formed between a sorcerer and oneself. See, the primary example of this sort of binding vow when binding vows were being explained is Nanami and his overtime vow, which restricts his cursed energy during the day to give him extra energy at night. This insinuates that binding vows are something similar to conditions in Nen, where the user must give themselves a restriction to gain a proportional amount of power, as Nanami puts away 20% during the day to gain that 20% after hours. The issue is this is not what happens at all as the series goes on, which fundamentally misleads the viewer. For example, at the end of Tokyo Colony 2, Hakari trades one of his arms in order to save the rest of his body. I don't know about you, but that doesn't exactly sound like an even trade to me. Compared to some of the atrocities committed with binding vows, this isn't all too bad. But it becomes a lot worse when we look at the biggest offender, and we all know who that is, right? It's Sukuna. Sukuna pretty much single-handedly ruined the concept of binding vows, specifically in the Maelstrom when he made a ton of binding vows to restore his domain. See, even with the binding vow that killed Gojo, it's at least explained what he gave up, as his conditions for using the word slash increased. Now, do I think it is an equal trade to use it one time with no issue on the one character the ability was literally made for? Not really, but it's kind of okay because there's at least an explanation. The Maelstrom, on the other hand, has no mention of what was given up in his series of binding vows. If the world slash binding vow destabilized the balance of binding vows, this completely destroyed the concept. As far as we can tell, he didn't give up anything significant to regain his domain expansion. For all we know, he could be sacrificing hairs on his head to restore his domain, which would be a crazy imbalance. If we're at least informed on what he gave up, I think it will instantly make this moment and binding vows in general a lot more stable. But we simply don't know what he gave up right now, and it kind of ruins the concept. There is a theory that these binding vows will end up coming back to bite him and he'll bind himself into a corner, but that hasn't been confirmed yet. The other issue with binding vows is that the protagonists seem to use them so rarely compared to people like Sukuna or Kenjaku. This could be due to lack of experience as they were both from the Heian era, but part of the issue is it inherently gives the antagonists an advantage simply because the protagonists don't use them, and there's no reason why they don't. This is a much smaller issue than the imbalances, but it's still worth mentioning. So how do I feel about cursed energy overall? In a lot of ways, cursed energy reminds me of Jujutsu Kaisen as a whole. It's not outright bad, and there are definitely some aspects that are executed really well, but there's also just so much untapped potential. Aspects of the power system like cursed energy reinforcement, how people obtain their strength, and cursed tools could have been so much better than they already are if just a few more chapters were put into developing them. So while I don't think it's right to say that cursed energy is outright a bad power system, it could have been so much better, and that's a bit disappointing. If you made it to the end of the video, please consider subscribing and checking out the other links in the description down below. Thank you so much for your support as always, it really does mean the most to me, and I'll see you again next week for our next video.